Good morning, Neighborhood Church. We welcome you to stand up with us as we sing. I praise in the valley, I praise on the mountains, yeah. I praise when I'm sure, I praise when I'm doubting. Come on! I praise when outnumbered, I praise when surrounded. 'Cause praise is the water my enemies drown in. As long as I'm breathing, I've got a reason to praise the Lord. Oh, my soul, sing praise the Lord. Oh, my soul, I praise when I feel it, I praise when I don't. I praise 'cause I know you're still in control. My praise is a weapon. It's more than a sound, more than a sound. My praise is a shout that brings Jericho down. As long as I'm breathing, I've got a reason to praise the Lord. Oh, my soul, praise the Lord. Oh, my soul. No, I won't be quiet. My God is alive. How could I keep it inside? Praise the Lord. Oh, my soul. Dance like it. I praise 'cause you're sovereign. Praise 'cause you reign. Praise 'cause you rose and defeated the grave. I praise 'cause you're faithful. Praise 'cause you're true. Praise 'cause there's nobody greater than you. I praise 'cause you're sovereign. Praise 'cause you reign. Praise 'cause you rose and defeated the grave. I praise 'cause you're faithful. Praise 'cause you're true. Praise 'cause there's nobody greater than you. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. Give it up. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. No, I won't be quiet. My God is alive. How could I keep it inside? I won't be quiet. My God is alive. How could I keep it inside? I won't be quiet. My God is alive. How could I keep it inside? Praise the Lord, oh my soul.
Remember those walls that we called sin and shame? They were like prisons that we couldn't escape. But he came and he died and he rose. Those walls are rubble now. Remember those giants we called death and grave? They were like mountains that stood in our way. He came, he died.
contradicting me. Why would I question your heart and the staff that comforts me? It quiets the waters, it quiets the storm inside of me. So what could be better than walking with him when I believe he has good plans? He has good plans for me. So I will take heart in deserts and gardens. He has good plans. He has good plans for me. If I know my Father, I know my Father has plans. He has good plans for me. If I know my God in deserts and gardens, He has good plans. He has good plans for me. If I know my Father, I know my Father has good We submit to your plans. We submit to your plans, So surely goodness and mercy will follow after me. So fear will find me, 'cause I'll be dwelling in the house of God. Surely goodness and mercy will follow after me. So fear will find me, 'cause I'll be dwelling in the house of God. Surely goodness and mercy will follow after me. So fear will find me, 'cause I'll be dwelling in the house of God. Surely goodness and mercy will follow after me. So fear will find me, 'cause I'll be dwelling in the house of God. He has good plans. He has good plans for me. So I will take heart in deserts and gardens. He has good plans. He has good plans for me. If I know my Father, I know my Father has good We thank you so much for worshiping with us this morning. Please take a seat, have a look at the screens.
Good morning, Neighborhood Church. I'm Lauren, and I'm so excited to welcome you today. Today is our mega awesome costume party. After today's service, you and your kids are invited to trick or treat around campus and take part in all the Halloween fun we have going on outside. If you're new to Neighborhood, you picked a great Sunday to be here. Drop into the Next Lounge before you leave. It's just outside our main auditorium doors. We have a friendly team of people in there whose mission is to make this place feel like home. November is almost here, and there are a couple of things we want you to know about as we look ahead. First is Pajama Jam, happening next Sunday, November 3rd. It's also daylight savings, so at NC Trinity Kids, we're celebrating by wearing pajamas to church. We'll have delicious breakfast goodies available during all 3 of our services that morning for the kids. It'll be a cozy and fun way to start the day. Also, coming up in November is our night of worship on Friday night, November 15th. This night is meant to encourage you and remind us of who God is and what He's done in our lives. Bring your friends and your family and kids to join us in worshiping together. It will be a great opportunity to connect with God and each other. So yesterday was our annual trunk or treat at Houston Neighborhood Park. It was so much fun seeing kids come through dressed up and connecting families with Neighborhood Degree. And many of you decorated a trunk and passed out candy. That's an example of what it means to be for our friends and neighbors. So thank you for making Trunk or Treat a huge success. Another way to be for our city is by giving to the mission of Neighborhood Church. Your financial generosity creates opportunities to serve our community and for everyone to grow deep in their faith. If you'd like to give to the mission, you can give online at ncvisalia.com/give. Text NC Visalia to 77977 or use one of the giving boxes located at the back of the auditorium. This morning, we're kicking off a new series called Becoming Yourself with our lead pastor, Forrest. Check it out.
Second service, how we doing? Hey, it is so good to be with you, even though the Dodgers keep... Okay, for those of you that don't follow baseball, what I'm about to say next is not going to matter to you. But for those that do, I gotta say, for as much as I really don't like the Dodgers, Game 1, Freddie Freeman, grand slam, walk-off, is that not why that's God's game, right? Baseball is God's game. So, hey, speaking of sports, though, this is also big week for Visalia High School sports. We've got the rivalry games, Battle for the Saddle, and Cowhide coming up this Friday. So, I mean, we have some Whitney people in the room. That figures. Redwood? Golden West? That was awesome. El Diamante, Miners? Well, okay. Not a lot of pride there. It's fine. It's okay. Hey, we are starting a brand new series this week, Becoming Yourself, and we're just looking at, how does this concept of God's grace sort of heal and restore our wounds and help us really sort of live into and out of the truest version of ourselves? And as I was thinking about this idea in our series, I just kept coming back to a movie I watched recently with my family. It's Pixar's latest, Inside Out 2. Have you seen this? Have you seen this movie? If you've not seen Inside Out 2, you probably haven't seen Inside Out 1, and you've got to reevaluate your life choices, because these are really, really good movies. And so just to catch everybody up to speed, these films sort of track the internal intricacies of our emotions, and it's all centered, the whole plot is centered around one young woman named Riley. In movie 1, Riley is a child who's moving into her tween years. In Inside Out 2, Riley is now a teenager facing all these new emotions and challenges as she navigates the complexity of growing up and adolescence in those teenage years. And if you could just, for a moment, to understand Inside Out 2, just think about those times in your life where your internal world has been so disordered and noisy that it's begun to impact your external world, how you behave and how you're interacting with other people. That's what's really going on throughout the movie Inside Out 2 with this young lady, Riley. And so in Inside Out 1, the emotional map of Riley is pretty simple. And we're introduced to just sort of 5 sort of core emotions: joy, sadness, fear, anger. That's kind of what we get in Inside Out 1. Oh, and disgust. Is there disgust is in there? Yep. And then in Inside Out 2, we're introduced to like more emotions. We're not getting rid of those first core. We're just adding to the situation, right? So you've got anxiety, embarrassment, envy, all of that is now. So as Riley grows, her level of emotional complexity is growing with her. And there's this moment in the movie, this very sort of pivotal moment where Riley is wrestling with something I think every one of us in this room has faced at some point. And Riley's wrestling with that feeling of not being good enough. And anxiety is now sitting at the control center of her mind. And anxiety is running the show. And anxiety is convinced it's doing what's best for Riley. But it becomes very clear very quickly it's in fact not. And Riley begins, once anxiety takes over, Riley begins to believe a very dangerous lie, that her value comes from her performance, that she only has value rooted in what it is she does, what she can produce, right? And the scene, I'm actually gonna show you a scene in just a moment, it just sort of vividly paints this picture when anxiety is sort of taking over and the once confident Riley now begins to second guess her every move and her every word. And the voice of anxiety that was whispering, "You're not good enough," is now sort of shouting, and it's this declaration she starts to believe. And her once colorful internal world, kind of operating primarily by the emotion joy, joy's now struggling to maintain control. And Riley's internal world begins to dim. Take a look.
Good person.
Oh no! Yes, come on! Here we go!
I'm not good enough.
What?
I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough.
Don't worry. It's just that she knows that there's always room for self-improvement. She'll be fine.
I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. All of us, at some point or another, wrestle with the feeling of not being good enough. And maybe it's because someone said that to us, or maybe it's just kind of this nagging voice in our mind that we sort of created. Right? Think about it. What's the first thing you do when you fail? When you fall short? When you don't meet even your own expectations? What do? Well, we start to question our abilities. We start to question our worth. And the voice of I'm not good enough, the volume sort of gets turned up on that voice, right? We tend to question everything about who we are, right? And this happens not just, it can be anything. I was thinking about those times somebody maybe has, you had lunch plans or something, and then somebody called and they just had to reschedule lunch, or they canceled lunch. Our first thought typically isn't, oh, they're busy. What do? We actually personalize the rescheduling of lunch. Now we're thinking, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? Why don't they want to have lunch with me? There's this like whisper of rejection that can just pop up in almost any situation. And we begin to doubt who we are and our worth. And it could be literally anything. I think for a lot of us, it's our bodies, right? We look in the mirror and we're not happy and we feel like we're not measuring up. Maybe it's just the family of origin we grew up in, or even the current family we're in, and there's just a lot of dysfunction, and we just think, well, I'm never gonna measure up to all those wonderful, perfect families that I see at church. And I know a lot of you, trust me, there's nobody's perfect here, right? Nobody is. For others, it could be finances. Maybe it's a habit, an addiction, can't seem to break, right? It's really everyday little moments. It's so easy to just feel like we're not keeping up. And I mean, this has been so well documented. Social media is not helping. All these well-curated reels and posts of perfect people doing amazing things, right? And we start doom scrolling, and we're like, oh, there's another example of why I'm terrible, and there's another example of why I'm terrible, another example, and pretty soon it's like, yeah, the volume on that I'm not good enough voice is pretty loud. It's pretty loud. In fact, there's one way this gets talked about, there's an author that I'm just kind of in love with right now. His name's Steve Cuss, and he's actually a pastor. He's written 2 books, Managing Leadership Anxiety and the Expectation Gap. These are 2 books, absolutely, they're must reads. But in them, he begins to outline in what he calls our mental committee members. He's basically saying, listen, we've all got these sort of voices, these influences, these thoughts, this conversation that's happening in our brain, and it's made up of all of these little different committee members, and these are these different voices, and they have different roles, and they have different perspectives, and they represent sort of our influences in life, right? Upbringing, social expectations, past experiences, internalized fears, trauma, all of that. And each committee member is given a voice, and they speak into how we see ourselves and how we respond to others around us. But here's the thing about our committee members. They're not awesome. They're typically not great. Our committee members often tend to amplify things like anxiety or self-doubt, fear, shame, unhealthy expectations, all of that kind of stuff. Our interior or our mental committee members, they're frequently sort of irrational. They distort reality for us. Pretty soon, all of a sudden, we've got all these false narratives that we're sort of living out of. And our internal committee members, they actually do way more harm than good because they're shaping a perspective of the world that isn't true. And now we're basing decisions and how we interact with others and how we see ourselves based on a whole reality that doesn't even exist. It was made up in our head by these mental committee members that want to protect us, but ultimately end up hurting us. Now, Cuss argues everybody's unique. Everybody's got their own sort of mental committee members, and you should do the work of sitting down and being able to name those. But he does say, look, there are some that are shared by more than most. There's just some more popular committee members out there that many of us share. And let me just give you a few that Steve Cuss will bring up. He says that one of the committee members a lot of people have is the people pleaser, right? This committee member is absolutely concerned with how others perceive you, right? This committee member will say things like, you need to make everybody happy, don't upset anyone, right? The people pleaser seeks approval at all costs, often at your own expense. Maybe for you, you're not a people pleaser, but you do maybe can relate to the next one, which is the fearful protector. This committee member is driven by fear and just avoids risk like at all costs. It tells you things like, I wouldn't try that. You're gonna fail anyway, right? It's too dangerous, don't put yourself out there, right? And the problem with the fearful protector is it comes across, it appears protective, but at the end of the day is actually holding you back from growing and becoming yourself. And all sorts of opportunities that you might have been able to step into. There's also the victim, right? The victim sees everything through this lens of defeat and hopelessness, right? It says things like, nothing ever works out for me, or why even bother? I'm gonna fail anyway. This committee member loves to trap you in this cycle of like self-pity and inaction. But for the purposes of our conversation today, there's a 4th one that gets shared by, I think, at least at times by most of us, if not all of us, and it's the inner critic. The inner critic. Right? Don't we all have this little voice in our head that It's kind of hard on us, right? The inner critic can be very harsh, very judgmental. It's the voice, it's the committee member that says, you're not smart enough, right? You're always gonna mess things up. You should know better by now. You are not good enough. And the critic doesn't just point out where you've maybe fallen short in the past. It wants to always sort of magnify your weakness, magnify mistakes. It's a voice that makes you feel small. It's a voice that makes you feel unworthy, right? And if we're not careful, the inner critic actually tends to want to be the loudest voice on the committee. It wants to be the chairperson of your interior or your mental committee. It's the voice of condemnation. It's the voice of shame. And after a while, like Riley, we start to believe, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. And sometimes it can be really hard to see it in ourselves, but maybe you've experienced it in a relationship that you're in, friendship, coworker, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. You offer encouragement and it's not received. Have you ever experienced that? Where you're like, oh my gosh, like you're so awesome, or I love you, I love this about you, or whatever, you're amazing, you did a great job. And it just feels like there's Teflon there, it just sort of like bounces off a little bit, and you could compliment all the time, you can offer reassurance, but it just never seems to be received, and it's never enough, and you keep wondering, what is going on with this person? Well, probably what's going on is their inner critic is the chairperson of their mental committee, and the volume is turned all the way up, and they're pretty much the only one talking, and so they don't really even have the capacity at this point to believe what you're saying, that they might actually be good enough, that they might actually be okay, that they might actually be worthy and worth caring about and loving, right? Our inner critic oftentimes becomes the chairperson and has the loudest voice in the room. And I think, this is where I think the Christian story has real value. So if you're new to Christianity and you're kind of wondering what's going on with this whole Christian thing and why people show up to church every Sunday and it's like a whole thing. Well, the Christian story's got a lot of layers. I think at the very least, the Christian story is really helpful when it comes to quieting our inner critic. You may not know this, but sitting right at the heart of what it means to be a Christian, a Jesus person, is the idea of replacing and retiring mental committee members like our inner critic and replacing the inner critic with Jesus and allowing the voice of Jesus and his love to begin to shape you into who you are always meant to be. Being a Christian is about learning to grow in our ability to let Jesus be the loudest voice in our heads and in our hearts. Following Jesus is about learning to let Jesus be the chairperson of our mental committee. But for that to happen, there's actually one concept that gets talked about in the Christian scripture. We call it the New Testament. There's one concept that if you've been around church, I'm not gonna say anything new today, but I hope maybe we begin to connect it and provide some connective tissue that maybe lets it sit a little deeper today. And maybe for those of you that aren't Christians, this might all be brand new information, but it's really, really important information, because if we don't understand what I'm about to talk about, we really are not going to understand Christianity on any level. We're gonna miss the whole point. And it comes from, what I'm about to share with you, comes from a very early convert to Christianity. We talk about him a lot around here. His name's Paul. Sometimes today we call him the Apostle Paul. Some traditions, even Saint Paul. And Paul was an early convert to Christianity, and he's a prolific writer and thinker. And in fact, most of Christian scripture is his. I mean, they're his. It's a bunch of letters he wrote that survived history, and now they make up the Christian scripture. And what's so fascinating about Paul is prior to him being a super Christian, he was kind of a radical Jewish religious leader who saw this new sort of upstart Jesus movement as dangerous, as something to be dealt with. It was a threat to his faith, the ancient faith of Judaism. And so Paul took it upon himself to do something about it, and he began arresting and torturing and imprisoning, and in some cases even executing people in the name of God. If they were running around claiming Jesus, he was going after them. But then Paul has this moment where he has this real experience with Jesus of Nazareth, and it changes him. But here's maybe what we don't think about. We think, oh, wow, crazy guy running around killing Christians is now a Christian. That's a great story. But think about that transition. The community that he was attacking, he is now a part of, right? He's a part of the community whose fathers and sons and cousins and aunts and sisters and mothers and daughters he had arrested, imprisoned, and in some cases executed in the name of God. And now he's going to church with those people. And he's having to look them in the eye. When I think about our inner critic, and when I think about the voice that says, I'm not good enough, if there's anybody that had the volume on their inner critic turned all the way up, it had to have been this guy, Paul. As he shows up at church and sings songs, standing right next to the people whose kid maybe he had killed. When he lied down at night and put his head on the pillow and all got quiet, there's no way he didn't hear the screams. There's no way he doesn't remember the look on their faces. There's no way he can't still relive the horror, the terror. I can't really, honestly, even imagine. Think about some of the awkwardness maybe you feel here at Neighborhood because you're in conflict with somebody here, or maybe your ex comes here, or whatever, and you're like, this is awkward. Not compared to what Paul dealt with at church, right? Can you imagine how loud his inner critic was? And here's the great thing. We know all of this because he doesn't ever deny any of it. In fact, in his letters, he writes about it. He talks about it. We're told about it. He's very honest. He's never trying to smooth out the rough edges of his story. He's just like, yeah, that was me. Somehow, and here's the thing, somehow Paul found a way where he didn't have to hide from that. He didn't have to lie about it. He didn't have to smooth out the rough edges. He was able to sort of step out into the light and own it all and share it all and leverage it as a story to change other people's lives. What did he come to know that maybe you and I knew once but have forgotten, or maybe have never known? What did he know? How was he able to do that? He tells us in one of his letters that he writes to the Christians in Rome. This is about the year 60 or so. And here's what he says. He says, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in. Now Christ, remember, Christ is not a name, it's a title, it means king. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in King Jesus. There's no condemnation for those who just say yes to Jesus and allow him to run the committee in their minds. There's no condemnation for those who say yes to Jesus' kingship in their life. There's no condemnation. The inner critic no longer gets a say anymore for those who are willing to sort of submit to Jesus and his way of love. I was actually, when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of just a crazy story that's actually kind of connected to the Valley. It's a story of a soldier who was a Nazi. He was a Nazi soldier. His name was George Gherkin. And George Gherkin in 1943 was, during World War II, was captured by British soldiers. And he was handed over to the Americans. And you may not know this, but during World War II, we actually brought a whole bunch of Nazi soldiers to America and put them in prisoner of war camps. And this is what happened to George Gherkin. And he was actually sent to Camp Deming, which is in New Mexico. And he's thinking at this point, I've been captured, I'm condemned. I'm a prisoner of war. I was part of the Nazi war machine, and for the rest of my life, I will live out as a condemned man. But here's the thing. George, in 1945, escapes from Camp Deming. He slips past a guard, he lifts up a fence, and he jumps on a passenger train. And the passenger train takes him all the way to California. Well, you can imagine, 1945, this happens, U.S. Army, massive manhunt, right? FBI is involved. George Gerken actually remains on the FBI's most wanted list for 40 years, right? It was like a whole thing. But once in California, he doesn't know what to do, and so he just finds work as a day laborer, even working at farms, different farms in Fresno, California, just up the road. George Gerken hung out for a few years. And he's moving from job to job because he never wants to stay in one place. He's terrified someone's gonna discover him, someone's gonna find out his real identity and find out he's a condemned man, and they're gonna send him back to prison, to prisoner of war prison. So ultimately, he gets more elaborate with trying to hide his real identity. He creates a new identity. Dennis Wiles is his name. He gets a Social Security card. He makes up a story about how he grew up an orphan because his parents were killed in a traffic accident. It's pretty elaborate. But he keeps moving. He'll never stay in one place for any amount of time. Well, eventually, life sort of begins to look up for George. He remembers before he was a Nazi soldier, he was actually a really good skier in Germany, and he was a really good tennis player in Germany. So he began to split time. In the spring and summer, he would live in the Bay Area, and he would be a tennis pro. He would teach tennis, and then in the winter, he would go to Tahoe, and he'd become a ski instructor. And then one day while he's in Tahoe, a passenger train coming from Colorado to California, they're on the Donner Pass, a passenger train called the City of San Francisco, gets stuck in a massive snowstorm. And they've got to have some expert skiers go rescue the passengers in the train. And so they recruit George. George is one of the rescuers. And this becomes such a big deal. Life magazine shows up, and they take a picture of the rescue party. And George is a part of that. Well, you can imagine George is not at all excited about the press. And he freaks out, and he thought, well, that's the end of my Tahoe ski instructor days. And he moves back to the Bay Area. In fact, he goes to a little town just south of Santa Cruz called Aptos. And in Aptos, he partners with a country club, and he becomes the tennis pro there, and he opens up a tennis pro shop. And he does that for a few years until there's a little bit of a falling out with the country club owner, and he fears again he'll be found out. And so he's been married now for 20 years at this point. He's never told his wife his real identity. But he says, wife, we've got to move. And they were going to go to Hawaii. We got to move again. And so she just puts her foot down. And I don't know if you have a wife that's ever put her foot down. It's a terrifying experience. And you're not given a lot of options in that moment. And she says, what's going on? I'm not going to move again. I'm tired of moving. We've been moving every few years for the last 20 years. And George finally just breaks down. And he tells her what he's never told anybody, his true identity. And she says, here's the foot down moment. Two things are going to happen. Either one, you don't go turn yourself in and I divorce you. Or two, you go turn yourself in and we work this out. And George decides to go turn himself in, knowing he's a condemned man, that he escaped prison 40 years ago, and he's about to spend the rest of his life in prison. And so he actually goes to the Immigration and Customs Office, and he turns himself in. He's 64 years old. And the immigration officers are hearing his story, make some calls, talk to some people, the FBI, the Army, they get the story, then they come back, and they just say to George, you're free to go. You're free to go. More than that, they say, here's a U.S. passport. You're now a citizen of the United States of America. And could you imagine that moment? Could you imagine having spent the last 40 years of your life terrified of a knock on the door? And every time someone stopped by and you heard that knock, you went pale. Your stomach started doing somersaults. They've shown up. They've found me out. I'm condemned, and I'm about to receive my punishment. That's it. And then to actually go turn yourself in and to have the authorities who have every right to condemn you go, good to go. In fact, here's a new passport. You're an American citizen. What would have that been like? And here's the thing, I'm assuming that nobody in here is an actual fugitive running from the law. And I know that's like a big assumption for this crowd. Like but I'm gonna assume the best this morning. But even though we're not actual fugitives of the law, I'm assuming many of us feel like we've been running our whole lives. Running from our inner critic who keeps reminding us of how we've made a mess of things. And I'm not good enough. And I'm not good enough. And I'm not good enough. I think a lot of us live under the tension and pressure of condemnation, of getting what we deserve, which is our inner critic's favorite message. And every day we're operating, just like George was, out of fear of a knock on the door, that we're gonna be found out, that people are gonna know what we're already convinced of. I'm not good enough. And it's this way of thinking that Paul's responding to when he says, if anything's true of Jesus, it's this: with him, there is no condemnation. With him, you can turn yourself in, and you won't get what you deserve. You'll get you're free to go. In fact, here's a new passport, a new citizenship, right? In fact, in another letter, Paul actually describes our relationship with Jesus as having new citizenship. He calls it being a citizen of heaven. The antidote for our inner critic is understanding this one thing about Jesus, that with him, there is no condemnation. You can walk into the authority's office, turn yourself in, and you get a new passport, and you don't get what you deserve. Here's the question, though. Why does Paul think that? I mean, why is he convinced that there's no condemnation in Jesus? Well, he's convinced of that because he believes one thing about Jesus. He believes in a concept called grace. Here's how he writes. Now, Paul is very complicated. He's very confusing. And so I'm going to read for you what Paul actually wrote, and then I'm going to try to make some sense of it. So here's what Paul says. He says, look, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in King Jesus. So go ahead, turn yourself in. You'll be okay. You don't have to run anymore, because you won't be condemned. You won't actually get what you deserve. So there's no condemnation for those who are in King Jesus because, and here's why Paul thinks this, because through King Jesus, and this is where none of what I'm about to read is gonna make much sense, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. So Paul now is comparing two sets of laws or rules, the law of what he calls the Spirit and the law of sin and death, right? Now, Paul's making the case, he's making the argument that when you say yes to Jesus, you're replacing an old set of rules, sin and death, he calls it, with a new set of rules, the Spirit, right? Sin and death is sort of how we classically understand rules and laws, right? There's rules and laws, and there's defining for us what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And they are really good at letting us know what we can't achieve and how we haven't measured up. And that can be really hard, and it can really amplify that inner critic voice in our head. And this old law, this sin and death that Paul calls it, it's only really good for one thing: holding us in our guilt, right? In a pattern of thinking that says, I'm not good enough. The law of sin and death is an amazing reminder to all of us that at some point in our lives, we didn't do it as well as we could have done it. But the problem with this law is that it doesn't really help us. I mean, okay, now I know. Thanks for that. Kind of already knew. Kind of already had a hint that maybe I haven't done everything perfect, right? But now what else can it do? Now you're just stuck, and you're just left with the message, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough. All that law can do is show us fault. When we fail, all that law can do is condemn. That's it. That's all that law can do. It can't heal us. It can't restore us, right? It can just remind us, here's your guilt. Here are those wounds. Here's that trauma. All that law can do is create a pretty obnoxious inner critic. But Paul's saying, but with Jesus, there's like a new law. There's a new set of rules. And they're totally the opposite of this other old law of sin and death. And now you can sort of step into this new law with Jesus, and this new law and this new set of rules, again, is best described with one word that Paul's a fanatic about. Grace. Grace. Law of sin and death, you're not good enough. Law of the Spirit, grace. This concept of no condemnation and love and compassion meeting you in the moment you're most terrified. In the moment somebody knocks on the door and you feel found out and your stomach starts doing somersaults and you go pale. It's that moment, the moment you're acutely aware of everything you're not. Paul's convinced Jesus is offering something called grace that steps in that moment, not to condemn you, and to lift you up out of it and offer you a new life, a new citizenship with him. Right in that moment when you're convinced, I'm not the smartest, I'm not the most accomplished, I'm not the most disciplined, yep, other people have worked harder, yep, I screwed that one up. I mean, grace meets us in our most painful moments, right? And it just wraps its arms around us and says, it'll be okay. We can move through this together. Grace is like we're stranded on the side of the road and don't know what to do. And we didn't pay our AAA membership and nobody's coming. And then Jesus pulls up and says, what do you need? What do you need? Grace liberates us to own all of the pieces of ourselves we don't love, or that we are having trouble making sense of. And because we can own it, it quiets our inner critic because we're not hiding. We're not trying to smooth the rough edges. We're just able to turn ourselves in. And on the other side of our confession is somebody just, okay, here's a new passport. The law of sin and death, that old law that Paul's convinced used to exist, it just keeps us from hiding and gives our inner critic this microphone reminding us, you're not good enough. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. And Jesus just steps in and says, no. I mean, maybe not. I mean, after all, who is good enough all the time? But it's not even the point. The point is, you're loved. We can work this out. You can stop hiding. You can own it all, and it'll be okay. Okay, so Paul believes there's no condemnation. Why does he believe that? He's convinced of something called grace, this new law of the Spirit, he calls it, that's replacing this sort of old law that just wants to kind of wreck you and keep you wrecked. Okay, well, how does all of that work then? I mean, get it. I get what you believe, no condemnation. I get why you believe it, grace, but I mean, how do we get it all? I mean, how do we did it just come out of thin air? I mean, what's going on there? And here's what he writes, and it gets even more confusing with this, but I'll do my best. He says, well, here's how. For what the law, that old law of sin and death was powerless to do. Can't restore you, can't heal you, can just remind you you're not good enough. That's all it can do. But then God sent his son, Jesus, in the likeness of a sinful flesh. So he's human, he's all the way human, to be a sin offering. Okay, the offering part, that's the cross. That's the cross. That's Jesus dying on the cross. I think we can look at the cross and see Jesus dying and just say, look, there was just another religious leader that was kind of a fanatic and he ended up getting martyred and a bunch of people kind of followed him and that was that. I mean, that's one way to look at the cross, but that's not how Christians look at the cross. Christians look at the cross and they're like, there has always been a cosmic battle going on in the heavenly realms, in this invisible realm between good and evil. And the cross is the climactic moment in that conflict. And ultimately, what looks like good losing, Jesus dying on the cross, is actually victory and evil losing, because it's God on the cross. God is flexing his supernatural muscles, allowing evil to kill him, and while doing so, carrying all the I'm not good enoughs that anybody's ever had or thought of, and saying, I'll go ahead and absorb it all. I'll take it all on. I'm gonna take that inner critic voice, I'm gonna hold on to that, I'm gonna take it from you, and I'm gonna absorb all of humanity's I'm not good enoughs, real or imagined. All the times you've missed the mark, all the times you've thought you're not good enough, Jesus on the cross, here's what Christians believe, that he's absorbing all of that and taking all of that on for you so you don't have to. So you can quiet your inner critic, so the inner critic can lose all of its power. Because what is left to condemn if Jesus carried all the condemnation? And so Paul believes very much that whatever's happening on the cross, and it's complicated and it's a lot, and books and volumes of books have been written about it. But at the very least, Paul's convinced that whatever was happening on the cross, Jesus was absorbing all the I'm not good enoughs and taking all of the condemnation that could come with that, all of the I'm not good enough in your head. He was carrying all of that. Why? So that in Jesus, there would be no condemnation, right? Jesus, who's Christians believe perfect, guiltless, was always good enough, the only one to live among us. Yes, to teach us how to live and love, all of that, but also to take on himself all the condemnation, all the I'm not good enoughs. All those moments you haven't measured up or feel like you didn't measure up. And said, I got this. In fact, the last thing it's like the last thing he says, his last breath before he actually dies, he says these words, it is finished. And he meant like truly finished. There's nothing else that you got to do. It's just, there's only something to receive. No condemnation. Forgiveness, maybe you could call it. See, I think many of us, we're so convinced. You know what heaven's for? Heaven's for good people. That is the dumbest, it's so stupid. Heaven is not for good. If heaven was for good people, I'm probably not going. That's right? Because I've got an inner critic who's constantly telling me I'm not good enough. You know what the cross reminds us? The cross, Jesus dying, all of that heaven isn't a reward for good people. It's a gift handed to forgiven people who have walked into the office and Jesus is standing there and you're like, well, here it is. Here it is. It's a lot, but here it is. And then Jesus going, oh, I forgot to tell you, you're good to go. No condemnation. Here's a new passport, right? So, just quick. Here's the whole passage again that we just read. Again, very complicated. Paul's using weird words and language. Therefore, there's no condemnation for those who are in King Jesus, because through King Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law is powerless to do, right? Restore you, heal you, quiet your inner critic. Because it was weakened by the flesh. God did, but God was actually able to do that. Well, how did he do it? Well, by sending his son, who ultimately would offer himself up on a cross and win the battle between good and evil and take away the power of your inner critic. So if I could explain that passage as simply as I can, I would say, this is Romans 8, verses 1 through 3, by the way. Result, Paul's convinced there's no condemnation. Why is he convinced of that? Because of grace. Well, how did you get grace? The cross. Our inner critic has us absolutely convinced, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. I am not good enough. But Jesus is like, I want to can I be chairperson of your mental committee? And if I'm chairperson, I have a new message. You're loved. You're loved. You're loved, and there is no condemnation. What's the Christian story? I'm sure we could talk about it a lot. There is no condemnation in Jesus. That's it. That's the Christian story. You're free to come out of hiding. You're free to stop listening to the inner critic. You're free to stop beating yourself up. But Forrest, I'm not good enough. I mean, really, Forrest, I have blown it. My inner critic actually has a point, right? Okay, maybe, but nobody's good enough except Jesus. It's why he came. Even if your inner critic has a point to make, its power, its grip on your life is gone with Jesus. And now you're free to step into everything God created you to be, to become yourself. Because that voice, that condemning voice of you're not good enough, it's gone. There's no condemnation. The craziest thing Christians believe, and Christians believe some crazy stuff, no doubt. Christians believe that it's only with Jesus that you can stand guilty. I am not good enough, but not condemned. You can walk into the office and say, here's my file, and have Jesus just put it in the paper shredder. Two things I think are true. Number one, for those of us, I think, that maybe grew up in church and maybe that's law of sin and death. That's like, you're not good enough. For those of you that grew up that way, I think it's often easy to convince ourselves maybe we are good enough and then point to other people we think aren't good enough and then tell them how not good enough they are. That's called religion. And that's not Jesus. And so us pointing the finger at somebody else because we think they're not good enough, we think we need to be their inner critic, stop. It's just childish and ridiculous, and it speaks to your own inner critic. It speaks to your own wanting to quiet that voice, so you need them to not be good enough. And the other thing, if the God of the universe, who is love personified, does not condemn you, why do you spend 1 minute beating yourself up, condemning yourself? Is that not arrogant? To think you know something Jesus doesn't. Yeah, I get it, Jesus. I know I'm not condemned. But I don't know. Is that not pretty arrogant? With Jesus, there is no condemnation. You can walk into the office, deserve to be sent back to prison, but leave free with a new passport. Just let that be true in your life. Let it quiet the inner critic. Let it allow you to become yourself. You're healed and restored. And that Jesus is the chairperson of the committee having a conversation in your head. How are we doing? We okay? Yeah? All right. Let's pray. Before I pray, our prayer team is going to be down up front and would absolutely love to pray for you. If you're a guest with us, we have something that we call the Next Lounge. It's go to the lobby, hang a right, there's a room, it's the Next Lounge, free gift for you, all of that stuff. Also, food trucks, all of that going on. Kids are going to be running around trick-or-treating. By the way, I was reminded of this. So we do this mega awesome costume party every year. And one year, sitting right here, right there, someone dressed up as that clown from It, Pennywise. Full thing, balloon, I sat here going, this is it, I'm gonna die. This will be the end for me. Mega awesome costume party, pastor murdered right on stage. And he just never moved. Mass, the whole, just staring right at me. And I'm like, Jesus, my insides were freaking out a little bit. So I love Mega. I'm always terrified Mega Awesome Costume Party. And today I just have Goofy down in front. Much better message for me up here. So thank you. No murdering clown. So that's, hey, let's pray. Jesus, thanks so much for today and so much for the message. There's just no condemnation. We get to come out of hiding. Walk into your office, hand all of our real not good enoughs and our imagined not good enoughs. We just can hand it all to you. And you take that whole file and put in the paper shredder. And we walk out free, restored, healed, with a new passport, a new citizenship. We're citizens of your kingdom, of your way,